There. Welcome everyone to the workshop on deployment skills, including simplex skills. This material has been developed over a number of years, originally by Michael Schulmuller, who will be teaching a different class this afternoon. I've contributed to it. Brian Scott's contributed to. Jim, who's helping today, has probably made some improvements as well. So here we go. We are going to try not to assume very much about your background because a few of you may be newly licensed, and all of us will remember that when we studied for the technician test, it was very hard to figure out which of this information we actually need to know for local emergency communications and which is just what we need to know to pass the test. Well, one thing that we sometimes say is pass the test and then the actual learning begins. So when it comes to certain types of radio skills for emergency communications, that's what this class is about. You may find it if you have some or a lot of experience. It will be a review of things that you kind of already know and maybe a few new things. We are having a citywide deployment exercise a week from today in the afternoon, where many of the skills will be very useful, but we will not today talk about the specifics of next Saturday afternoon's exercise. If you are participating in that, you should receive an email from me in the coming week giving you detailed instructions, and then you email me with your questions, or you say, can we get on a phone or Zoom call? I will be very available in the upcoming week to answer questions specific to that exercise, but today will be a bit more general, and we'll set the stage for that exercise, for future exercises, and most importantly, we believe it will be useful skills for actual deployments. So speaking of actual deployments, if the ground shook and you went to check your cell phone and you didn't seem to have a connection anymore because your local cell tower was down, and you went to check your landline if you still have one and it was down, how would you know whether you're supposed to deploy? Well, don't trust me for the exact details of that, but I'm under the strong impression that if you have a net badge with the Portland Neighborhood Emergency Team program and you cannot communicate by telephone or computer, you are allowed to self-deploy. That means two things if you're a radio operator. One is your team's operations plan may call for you to go to your staging area or use FRS radio to talk to your team leader or something else. Do whatever your operation plan says to do when you're self-deploying. But either before or after you go to your staging area, you're going to want to get on MC2 and check in to the resource net. If that repeater is down for the same reason the cell towers are down, use channel 12 in the MC areas template, which will get you the same frequency, output frequency, but there will be no offset, so that you'll be transmitting on the output frequency. In other words, you'll be using that repeater's output frequency for simplex communication, unless until the repeater comes back up, in which case you need to go back to MC2 so that you're transmitting on the input frequency. After checking in, or perhaps just before you are asked to check in by the resource net operator, we're hoping that that Multnomah County Areas operator will have an update for you on Portland Net regional subnet frequencies. We will talk about the standard frequencies in a few minutes, but there may be last minute changes. The changes could be because not all the subnet controllers are available yet. They're taking care of their own households, or maybe deploying to their own staging area or conducting search and rescue. So we're short on subnet controllers. We may then combine regions, at least temporarily, So the standard frequency may be different. Something that also likely in a big disaster is ham radio operators are popping onto frequencies willy-nilly and making them busier than on a normal day. And some of those might be for emergency communication and adjoining counties. So we may need to make last-minute changes to the regional frequencies, and those would be announced on the resource net as soon as we figure them out and convey them to the resource net operator. And I'll be talking about standard frequencies and how we got to standard frequencies a bit later. But again, you're going to probably want a hard copy of the standard frequencies that I'll show you later. And then the resource net will tell you about changes. The resource net will probably release all net operators to their subnets fairly early. During an exercise, this is pretty crisp and clean because we develop a script that talks about when we open the resource net, when people check in, when the frequency table is read, and when people are released. During an actual disaster, it's going to be some level of chaos because the person running the resource net did not receive a script 3 days before saying, when the earthquake comes, here's your script. They're operating off of a standard script and improvising. So some of this will come out of order over an extended period of time, will change over time. You may find yourself checking in 5 hours after the earthquake instead of 15 minutes after the earthquake. So stay flexible. Hopefully this will not happen anytime soon, but it's one reason why we take these classes, be prepared for that possibility. Any questions so far? Once you have your regional frequency and you're released, you go to that frequency, wait for the resource net operator to open check-ins and then check in. When your shift is over, you're going to need to tell your subnet controller you're checking out. We're negotiating with areas as to whether they want us to check out from the resource net before we turn off our radio. We've done it both ways, and next Saturday we will not be checking out from the resource net, but stand by for updates about that particular step. Once again, let you get a word in edgewise. Any questions from anybody? I'm not monitored. Well, maybe I do see chat over here. No, that's chat left over from the previous session. So I'll try to monitor chat, but if you don't hear me reading your chat message, you're going to need to shout. So we have nets and subnets. These, a normal net will often be held on a repeater. We have a couple of nets on repeaters on Sunday evenings. Local clubs and other organizations have nets at other days and times. But nets can also be held simplex without a repeater. And we are assuming that either most of the repeaters will be unavailable during parts of the major disaster. Some will be unavailable, and we don't know which. Or the ones that are still up are overloaded with a variety of traffic on a variety of things and not available to the net program. Even if there was one repeater that was available to the net program and was up and reliable and accessible from all parts of Portland, in a real disaster, there could be 70 or more teams trying to use that one repeater. And if you think about some of your training, when you're trying to communicate in a hierarchical fashion, it's usually a maximum of 7 people connected to one coordinator or supervisor. And having to coordinate emergency messages across 70 teams on one repeater is a recipe for disaster. So we would need probably 6 to 10 repeaters, all active and accessible, in order to run the net program during a major disaster using repeaters. So instead, we're assuming the worst, that except possibly for the resource net, there will be no repeaters, and we're going to operate simplex. Because we're operating simplex, we have to account for the hilly nature of Portland. There are some places that, even if they're a mile or two apart in Portland, you can't communicate because there's a big hill in the way. There are other places where you'd like to be able to communicate 3 or 4 miles. You've got enough power to do that. You've got an antenna that should be able to do that. But again, there's a hill in the way, or maybe a high-rise building in the way. So we divide Portland up into regions. Michael Schumiller did a great deal of work probably 4 or more years ago, studying propagation paths and geography, and divided Portland up into 9 simplex regions. We seldom operate all 9. We usually combine at least 2. Sometimes several are combined. So we tend to run between 5 and 8 subnets at a time. And during a full exercise, those subnet operators also have a communication path to the Emergency Coordination Center radio room on the east side of the city. So we're using a layered approach, and I'll show you a diagram about that in a minute. Our standard approach is to use VHF frequencies in the 2-meter band, but that band is getting more and more crowded. To manage that crowdedness, the various ARES organizations that serve at the county level every 2 years compare notes about what frequencies they want to use. It's driven by a desire to bring the county level templates up to date. And so some changes are often made in order to be polite and not step on other counties. In the last round, we had to make some changes in that regard, but we also used an opportunity to request some additional channel numbers be assigned to Multnomah County and the Portland Net program in particular, and we were quite successful in that. That does not guarantee that those will always be available to us, but it does reduce the chance that an adjoining county will jump on them during emergency deployment, because they've got their own channels in their template that are, in most cases, different channel numbers, different frequencies. We may, in some cases, run out of VHF frequencies and have the alternate frequency be in the UHF 70 centimeter band, which has a lot more room. Some argue that we should be using that band a lot more, and we'll be investigating that in the coming year. Historically, we've shied away from the UHF band for distances more than a couple of miles because rather abstract reasons called, I think it's called Fresnel refraction or something. VHF signals are not quite as demanding as line of sight as UHF. That there's more, effectively, there's more bending, whether that's literally true or not. And it's a little bit more forgiving if you don't have line of sight in the 2-meter band than the 70 centimeter band at the same wattage, same size of antenna. But there are cases when the UHF does work fine, and so we may start using UHF more in the future. So here's a diagram we could spend an hour on. Instead, I'm going to give some hints about it. The first hint is that if you're operating for a team during a deployment, all you need to know is that you're connected to a regional subnet, and that some of what you do will be relayed on to the ECC magically by your subnet controller. So if you're in the Alameda North subnet, you might you'll have an actual team name, but in this diagram, I'm not assigning team names. So maybe you're the equivalent of Team 5 in Alameda North. You're commuting back and forth with your Alameda North operator. That operator may also be communicating by WinLink to a WinLink gateway that's shown in red, communicating to the Emergency Coordinator Center on a tactical frequency, particularly with inbound traffic to the radio room, communicating with the command net, which is often outbound announcements or outbound requests, shown with a green arrow there. So it's a bit complicated, but the hierarchical nature reduces the complexity to any one operator. If you're a subnet controller, you've got an increased level of complexity, and that's why we're having a net controller training this afternoon, led by Michael Schillmuller, and it's why we had a WinLink training a week ago in the afternoon, also led by Michael. And if you're not doing those trainings now, you may want to do them later so that you can become available. You think about it, while your team probably needs multiple AROs for an extended deployment, we also need multiple ham radio operators to serve as subnet controllers. If we're going to run 10 to 18 hours a day during a disaster, that can't be one person all the time. It's going to be have to be a team of people rotating for those subnet controllers. I didn't mean to go forward yet. So let me take a breath and take any questions about this very complicated diagram. You'll notice that Alameda North alphabetically is in A's, W west side is on the right, and the 3 dots in the middle allude to the potential for 7 more subnets not shown on this diagram. Okay, didn't see anything pop up in chat, didn't hear anything, so I can come back to this as needed.
It's a radio class.
Was that a book?
100% dedicated to it.
I don't know.
I made creme brulee.
You did.
Mm-hmm.
I tried.
Haven't tasted it yet, but
Okay, I just did a mute. So here are those simplex regions that Michael worked out. Columbia is very long and wide along the Columbia River. Fortunately, that's fairly flat. So they can communicate roughly east-west relatively easy, although there are some challenges communicating from the St. John's area all the way to the eastern edge of that region. The west side is relatively large, not quite as big as it's shown here, because somewhere there is the boundary of the city of Portland turns into Washington County there in Beaverton. But it's a fairly large region. Some of the other regions are smaller because of terrain obstacles. Some of you have historically served as subnet controllers in one or more of these regions. Now, your starting point is to find your location of your home or your staging area on this map. You may have to compare it to a more detailed map, old-fashioned or online, to approximate where you are. That will probably be your first choice for the subnet, but I can easily imagine that there will be corners of your region where you would have better propagation to an adjoining region. Good propagation trumps staying within your color, if you will, because you're going to want simplex is seldom perfect, but you're going to want to get it as best as you can, both for exercises and deployments. So if you find that you're getting a clearer connection to an adjoining region than your own region, so to speak, I'd recommend you check into the adjoining region. That gets interesting to predict, because let's say you're in the blue, southeast, and you participate in an exercise, and Jim Weissram, who's here today, is your subnet controller, and you hear him clear as a bell. I don't know his exact home location, but I'm on the distinct impression it's on the right-hand side of this blue triangle. So maybe you're on the right-hand side of the triangle, and you're good to go. Well, a month later, we're having a simplex exercise, and the subnet controller is somebody in the bottom of this blue triangle, and your propagation is completely different. Well, now maybe you should be checking into Alameda South or Outer East. Maybe you'll get better propagation with one of those regions, at least until Jim Weissgram takes a shift and he becomes a friend. Of course, the opposite could be true depending on where you are whether you're operating out of a window on the east, north, west, or south side of your domicile, etc. Your little experimentation goes a long ways here to tell you what propagation is working. And I'm serious there that sometimes it appears to be a distance problem, but it's just shifting a few feet, rotating your body, holding your antenna a little bit more vertical can make a difference. And over time, connecting an external antenna can make a big benefit. Partly because those antennas are bigger, but mostly because you can get them up higher. If you just attended the programming class, we talked a lot about Baofengs. Some other time, or perhaps at the end of today's session, I'll tell the long version of the story, but the short version is Baofengs are pretty good radios unless you're operating near the west side hills where all those commercial towers are. They tend to go deaf in that part of the city. And if you're in another part of the city and you hook up a great antenna to a Baofeng, you just moved yourself to the west side and you're overwhelmed by those broadcast towers. You may get out better on the transient side, but you can't hear anybody, and that doesn't work. So be quite hesitant to use an external antenna with a Baofeng radio. They get overwhelmed by broadcast signals very easily. I'd love to talk about that for 10 minutes, but I better not. Now I need to introduce something that's not specific to radio because I'll be referring to it in a few minutes. About 4 to 6 weeks ago, Glenn, PBAM arranged for a FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, local district 10, is it? Or 2 maybe, whatever, the local FEMA district has a person who's quite expert on community lifelines. These do not go back 20 years like a lot of FEMA stuff. FEMA discovered, I think it was 3 to 5 years ago during probably a hurricane disaster, that they were having trouble helping the local counties, cities, and states recover from a disaster because they weren't organizing their priorities well, and they made what appears to be a breakthrough and said, when FEMA comes to town, they need to be thinking about, should they be helping restore energy? Should they be helping restore health and medical infrastructure? Should they be helping restore communication infrastructure, transportation? You see the list here. We can imagine in a Cascadia that there are huge problems in all 7 of these categories. I'm hoping that that's not true, that maybe one part of the city loses a bridge, another part of the city has broken water main, another part of the city loses cell towers, another part of the city has trouble with the road accessing a hospital. Nevertheless, these categories are useful. What can be solved by the local water bureau? What can be solved by the local fire bureau? What can be solved by a utility company? What can the hospital do to set up a triage tent outside its hospital, etc.? And then how can FEMA help when they come to town? It won't be in the first few hours. Why do I tell you this story? Right after disaster, Portland and the county and adjoining counties have a plan for sending out public service and utility vehicles to assess the situation for, I think, at least an hour. Here's where I get fuzzy. And they will come be able to report by radio or come back to headquarters and report about what they see. And it might be a broken water main, a gas main problem, a bridge on-ramp that's compromised, etc. But they won't see everything. They won't be able to see broken fiber optic cables. They won't necessarily know whether the power is cut off to a particular cell tower. They will go back to their normal duties. The fire department will not be surveying continuously for 12 hours. They'll be fighting fires or conducting rescues. In hour 2 or hour 10 or hour 20, or maybe 3 days into an extended disaster, the Emergency Coordination Center will say, how do we get more information about X? And somebody, PBAM will say, we've got a ham radio-based communication that's come up over the last hours and days that operates radio to radio. They call it simplex, whatever that means. We could get a request of information to up to 70 teams to try to get answers about water pressure, or about broken water mains, or about arterials that are blocked by trees or landslides. So we may get a request that's specific to one of these community lifelines. We may have information based on search and rescue, but it may not fit neatly into these categories because we're concentrating at the local level on helping our neighbors and figuring out where best to do first aid or search and rescue. The request comes in, the answer may be on our Form 1s, or it may not. We may need to go gather that information. Over time, your operation plans may get more oriented in these areas. I don't know. But I predict that if we ever have a disaster and the main communication path to our teams is radio, we'll start getting information requests, and we need to think about how to respond to them. Any questions about what is a community lifeline category and what the heck it has to do with radio? So let's talk about communication with occasional reference to lifelines. The Emergency Coordination Center may have information that would be useful to a net team. It may be that by noon on the third day, there'll be water trucks available in certain parts of the city because they know the water pressure is low or has failed in that part. It may be that a particular hospital has set up a triage tent at one of their clinic locations in a parking lot. So we may be getting information that, roughly speaking, is either the status of a compromised lifeline or a temporary improvement to a lifeline or a permanent improvement. The power's back on. You may want to recharge your batteries now. In the second category, information requests, I already alluded to that. They may need to know more about what the compromises are, what the problems are at the neighborhood level, and we may get a request. And it may be a lifeline category, or it may say, how many immediates do you have? Or to use a fire station metaphor, how many reds do you have? In day 3, hopefully we'll never have this problem, but they might be asking, how many deceased do you have? Or they might have a tactical, finally have enough bandwidth in day 7 to ask about your tactical needs. Do you need a refresh of your first aid supplies? Do you need 50 gallons of water delivered for cleaning wounds? The third category is the one that we used to practice during our citywide deployment exercises, where every team would pretend that they had a need for something and make a request for an ambulance, make a request for water delivery, etc., all in a 2.5-hour exercise. Well, if the exercise was simulating day 5, maybe that's realistic. But from talking to PBAM, the Emergency Coordination Center will be working on big picture issues for many hours and will not be in a position of providing focused local help. I'm hoping that before the earthquake comes, we have also communication path to other resources like the local fire station, which Beacon relates to that, but I'm going to try not to speculate about Beacon during today's workshop. Or there's something called battalions in the fire station world, where there are about 7 fire stations per battalion, and each battalion has a battalion chief. Maybe we'll have a radio communication path battalion chief that says, XYZ battalion, this is Maplewood. Is there any chance that we can get a transport of 2 seriously wounded residents of our neighborhood? That if that communication path worked, the battalion chief might be able to say, you're number 12 on our list. We'll try to get to you within 3 to 5 hours. Or may say, you're on your own for a couple of days, or may say, don't ask me, contact the ECC. But that's all speculative at this point. Other forms of radio communication that we're not focusing on today, but for the record, FRS and GRMS, as radio operators, you may need to play a leadership role in training or coordinating this communication during a disaster. 70 centimeter amateur radio communication might be used within your team if you've got multiple licensed amateur radio operators, between adjoining teams for similar reasons, or as an alternative VHF if the VHF frequencies are more crowded than they are on an everyday basis. So we'll talk a little bit more about UHF today, but it is part of the solution, even though we're focusing on VHF. Questions on this slide or the previous one? So I promised to talk more about frequencies and VHF frequencies. I also mentioned it in the 8 o'clock session. The 2021 template that Multnomah County ARES coordinated with adjoining counties and published on their website late summer last year. In the big template that's got 400 or more channels, I think as many as 500 if I remember correctly. You'll find our regional frequencies are NetTAC 4 to 12. And those are the temporary standard or maybe permanent standard is NetTAC 4 is assigned to Alameda North, NetTAC 5 to Alameda South, etc. If you're using an HT with restricted number of channels, they're squished into the 70s, and you'll find them there, channel 68, 68 through 76. Those same templates have NetTAC 1 and 2 at multiple places. At the neighborhood level, you're discouraged from using either of those because those are reserved for communication between subnet controllers and the Emergency Coordination Center. And NetTAC 3 is a backup frequency for NetTAC 1. They would seldom be used at the same time because they're so close together, they tend to interfere with each other. And here's a case where you could make a hard copy of this table or the equivalent from a exercise instructions and post it on your wall or put it in your Go kit or your backpack or all three, and refer to it when you're on the resource net. And you might discover that indeed, if you're in the River South region, the resource net announces that you're on 145.79, and you can find that in channel 398 or channel 74. You circle that on your hard copy. Or you might find that River North and River South are combined and you're using the River North frequency until further notice. Or both those frequencies are blocked by adjoining counties, and that they have chosen a UHF frequency standby for a frequency starting with a 4. Any questions about this table? For somewhat obvious reasons, I refer to the template that has lots of frequencies is the large template, and the one that has only 127 is small. Their official names on the Multnomah County ARES site, the large one is called Standard, the small one is called MHT, which stands for Multnomah Handy Talkie or Multnomah Handheld Transceiver. The web page is at the bottom. You can also navigate to multnomahARES.org and click on resources, click on frequency list. In that same template are 21, it almost said 22, but it starts at NetTAC Team 2. And these are all UHF frequencies in the 70 centimeter band. That's the frequencies you see second from the right. If you're technically inclined, you may know that FRS radios and GRMS radios use ultra high frequencies, but their actual frequencies of those radios are not shown here because, let's see, they're up in 462 and 467 megahertz. So why do we refer to those when we talk about this? Because most or all teams have chosen an FRS channel number for unlicensed communication within their neighborhood. Some of those were assigned to their neighborhood 3 to 5 years ago, and others have been changed at their request because some of the low numbered frequencies got assigned to too many neighborhoods because there was a time when FRS radios only supported 8 channels. Nowadays, any FRS radio that I've seen I advertise supports 22 channels, and on the output side they are the same as the GMRS frequencies of the same number. So we have 22 to choose from. Because channel 1 is so often used by kids and families, I don't know of any team that's using FRS GMRS channel 1, so it's not shown in this table. So how do you use the table? If your team has chosen channel 6 for FRS communication, we recommend that you use Portland Net Team 6, abbreviated here under alias column PNT M06, which would be found in channel 406 of the big template and 106 of the small or MHT template. And if it's not found in either place, go to VFO mode and put in 431.500 megahertz, and you will be operating simplex on amateur radio 70 centimeter band, not FRS. But if there are other operators in your neighborhood or joining neighborhoods on that frequency, you can talk to them on UHF without conflicting with FRS and without conflicting with VHF. Let me say one more thing and then take a breath for questions. When you use a channel or frequency that's on one of these tables, the question is, how do you know where other people are? The two most common answers are prior agreement and alternate communication path. Prior agreement means that you've got an operation plan paragraph for your team that says all the AROs, when they're not checked into a subnet, will communicate on the PNet Team 6 because you're channel 6. And so you all go there because that was part of your operation plan. Or your team has got an agreement with an adjoining team in your part of Portland, and you've all agreed to use PNet 13 for tactical communication between your two teams. And you're pretty sure that that won't conflict with other teams within line of sight. So that's a prior agreement protocol for choosing one of these channels. The other is a more spontaneous, but it requires a communication path. You could work that out by email or phone, but we're going to assume both of those are down in a worst case. So you might need to work with your regional simplex operator to choose a UHF frequency to communicate outside of your subnet for tactical communication. And we may have a chance to talk a little bit more about that later. So with that footnote, any question about this table or the previous table? So let's talk about regional subnets. Occasionally, the subnet controller has to go talk to the Emergency Coordination Center. And if the traffic is light and expected to be light, they may say, all stations, please stand by. I'll return hopefully within 5 minutes. please stand by with any traffic, or you are free to use this frequency for tactical communication until I return. The other possibility, distinct possibility, because we recommend it when we train subnet controllers, is to pick another station to serve as temporary interim subnet controller. That's a little tricky because they have to kind of guess an operator that has reasonably good propagation with the other teams. But sometimes you can conduct some experiments polling every operator on the subnet to say a few words so that the others can make notes about who they can hear well, who they can't hear at all, etc. And then that might give you a more informed way of choosing an interim subnet controller. So if you think you're getting close to the right skills to be an interim subnet controller, and even if you're not ready to do the whole job, be ready to volunteer during an exercise so that you're even more ready during actual deployment. If your incident team leader says they need you for something else, maybe to coordinate FRS traffic, or you need to take a bio break, or you're exhausted and you need a rest, please check out your subnet controller. Ideally, you'll have somebody else to take over, but if that's not possible, you still should tell your subnet controller that you'll be away and try to estimate how long before either you'll be back or your replacement will take over. By that time, you should have established a tactical call sign for your team's subnet communication. If you're succeeded by somebody else, they will inherit your tactical call sign, but of course they don't inherit your FCC call sign. But that's one reason why we have tactical call signs. The subnet controller can think of your team by its tactical call sign and not worry too much about who happens to be on duty at the moment, as long as propagation is halfway good. Another cautionary thing is watch out for open mic. It is possible with some radios to set a radio down on a table and have it do the push to talk for you. A more common problem is you plugged in a headset because you want to be able to hear and have your hands free to write on a clipboard, but you didn't plug it all the way in, and that headset connector shorted out the push to talk, and you are transmitting continuously. Really tough to know you did that unless you happen to look down and see the transmit light on your radio. You can't hear anything because you're transmitting. Your subnet controller may say, whoever's got an open mic, cut it out, but you didn't hear that. So 2 ways to avoid that, 3 ways to avoid it. One is to check and double check that your radio's configured right, the headset's completely plugged in, you're not gripping your radio so tightly that you're pushing the push to talk. 2 is, if you've got another ham nearby, ask them to check the frequency and see if they hear you or the subnet controller. And the, what was the third one? If you're not hearing anything at all, that's a hint that either you've got your squelch set wrong, your volume set wrong, or you're currently transmitting. And this is repetitious. If the exercise is over or the deployment is shutting down for the night, or at the end of a major deployment, everybody will be asked to check out and the net will be closed either indefinitely or until the next shift. So in an ideal world, every formal message handed to you will have a precedence in the subject field. I think later we may have a slide on precedence, but in brief, the highest is emergency, the second is priority, third is health and welfare, and fourth is routine. In some worlds, emergency means life and death. In some worlds, it's life and death or major property damage is imminent. If it's neither of those, it's probably priority. Priority means as soon as possible. This is time sensitive. Health and welfare means less than that, typically has to do with the status of somebody, but not whether they're going to need immediate attention. And routine would be the stuff we do every day during a non-emergency case, and would seldom be communicated during an emergency unless there's a real quiet period. We need to keep training our incident team leaders and those that serve in that role to understand those precedents, because if everything's marked emergency, then very few things will get through and lives will be lost. So when you have more than one message, you need to sort them by precedence and report how many of each. If you have only one message, you need to know what that one is. Is it a priority message, a health and welfare message, or emergency message? And let the subnet controller know what it is, so they can either say, stand by with your priority message, and then neighborhood 7, go ahead with your emergency message, etc. Just like we triage in first aid, we triage messages. Any questions about that? I'm often tempted to say we assign priority to messages, but you see why that's a problem. Somebody years ago made the word priority a pro word, standing for second only to emergency. So you have to use the word precedence to refer to the levels. It's more syllables, but it's different than the word priority in this context. So this just expands on that. South Heights, stand by with your traffic. North Heights, go ahead with your emergency message. It's a little trickier if the subnet controller is taking a health and welfare message and you've got a life-threatening emergency. If it appears they're just about done, you should probably let them finish and say, end of message, how copy, roger your message. But if they're at the beginning of what might be a long routine message, you may need to wait for a brief gap so you're not doubling, and use the pro word emergency. If it's an emergency, don't bother with the call sign until the subnet controller says emergency, go ahead. And then you can say this is Maplewood with emergency traffic. And then if the controller wants it, and usually say who it's for. If it's for ECC, subnet controller will probably take it. If it's emergency traffic for the adjoining neighborhood, subnet controller may ask the team ARO for that neighborhood to stand by to copy a message directly on this frequency. Or in a really busy situation, they might assign a UHF frequency for that traffic. Question in chat. Oh, does anybody not know what doubling means? That's what's Jim. Jim knows the answer. We see it often on check-ins of on repeaters, but it can happen just as easily in simplex. When you're operating with FM and there are two signals of similar strength, they will garble each other and neither will get through. If one signal is substantially stronger than the other, then on the receiving end, usually the receiver will be able to decipher most of the stronger signal and none of the weaker signal, and may ask the weaker signal to say again. After some practice, you'll get used to hearing the weird garbly noise that a doubling makes. But our procedures on both repeater traffic, so-called duplex and simplex, tend to reduce doubling but don't eliminate them. So if you hear doubling, be prepared for, and you're not the receiver, be prepared for the net controller to ask for say again or a standby.
Sorry, Bruce, this is Jim. I thought we could do all that without interrupting you.
No problem.
Yeah.
I could have taken that hint, but I didn't.
Yeah.
So how are we doing on time? We're going to do a breakout exercise at 11 o'clock, no matter what slide I'm on. So you won't have to hear me talk slides for more than another 8 minutes. At the end of your shift, check out your subnet controller and try to help that transition by letting the subnet controller know about your replacement, if any, and make sure your replacement knows what your tactical call sign is, because they should take over that call sign. When you leave, you're probably going to want to mention both your FCC call sign to stay legal with the FCC and your tactical call sign. And you should give your FCC call sign at the end of what appears to be a case where you're not going to speak again soon, because you don't expect a reply. So often the way I think about that is, if you don't expect a reply, end with your FCC call sign and the word out. If you do expect a reply, then just say over and give your FCC call sign at the end of the communication. We're hoping that the resource net will take net checkouts, but there's some ambiguity in the standard operating procedures. So for the next couple of exercises, we will not be checking out of the resource net until we get that resolved one way or the other. As net operators, you'll be using a form called Net Form 6, which is based on the ICS 309. But we use it a little different than Ares uses it. So we'll talk a little bit about, time permitting, about Form 6. But in any case, you're going to be logging the important stuff on Form 6. If something's totally illegible, you can correct it afterwards, especially if you did it in pencil. It doesn't have to be perfectly legible in order to turn it in at the end of the exercise. You can scan it, you can use a cell phone camera, or you can put it in snail mail, or maybe you typed it into the computer because you're a neatnik, but keep in mind that the computer is probably not available during an actual disaster. It might be available for an hour before the battery starts getting weak, or maybe you got a really good laptop and it's good for 6. The challenge of simplex are many. This is a table of contents slide, so I'm not going to read it. I'm going to launch into the next slide. When you go in the field, I encourage you to use less power than you might be if you're at home. There's a ham radio guideline that says always use the minimum power because you're less likely to interfere with other people miles away or on adjoining frequencies. But that could be super critical during extended deployment where the grid power is down or you're away from grid power for hours at the time. Can you imagine having a great connection because you're operating at 5 watts for an hour and then your battery's dead and you have no connection? You'd be better off struggling with a 1 watt connection or a ½ watt connection and operating for 5 hours. You might make it to the end of the shift. Even better would be have lots of batteries, but if you've got one of those clever ways of using alkaline batteries with your handheld during a major disaster, you may eventually run out of alkaline batteries. You may also be using a shorter antenna at a lower elevation than you might at home. So that makes operating a staging area challenging. Some of our staging areas are at higher elevations in our homes and some are at lower. So you're going to want to practice at both locations. One disadvantage of having our exercises at home so much during COVID is we're not testing the propagation at our staging areas. So I'm looking forward to get the summer and post-COVID era of doing more at staging areas because that's more real for actual deployments. Jim gave you a tip in chat that I will not repeat because you can read it. So we need to talk a little bit about what to do if no one hears you. It may turn out that the subnet controller can't hear you, so doesn't know that he or she should be acknowledging you. But one of the operators, perhaps closer to you or on a better side of a geographic obstacle, does hear you. but is trying to respect the leadership of the subnet controller by letting the subnet controller check in stations that can be heard. But if you occasionally give your call sign, in this context, your tactical call sign would be sufficient. That other station may step in at the end of check-ins and say the word relay to the subnet controller, or may say, this is Maplewood, I have a relay. And if you have all the if the relay station has all the information, because then they may simply give it, and the subnet controller may say, you're checked in. If the relay station said XYZ is trying to check in, they can hear you, but you can't hear them, then the subnet controller might say, thank you, such and such, you are checked in, you're done, okay? But if the subnet controller cannot be heard by that other station and vice versa, the smart thing for the subnet controller is to say, Maplewood, please serve as subnet controller and check in that station for me and provide the information when you're finished. And that is now a delegating situation similar to what we talked about when that controller leaves the frequency, but it's probably shorter in duration. You may be the relay station, you may take that information and then return control back to the subnet controller who asks for the information, you're done. If it's at the end of the check-in, the subnet controller may say, Maplewood, I don't know how many stations can't hear me. Could you please repeat the check-in instructions and check in any and all stations not yet checked in? Then you need, if you're the relay station, you need to improvise and say, this is Maplewood acting as temporary subnet control for the West Side region. At the request of net control, I hereby request any additional check-ins not yet acknowledged. You're then busily copying down that information and preparing to provide it to subnet control once you're finished. So interesting protocols here. I'm not going to read this slide. Most of you received a PDF, so you have the tiny URL at the bottom. You could scribble down right now while I'm talking, PDX simplex advice. If you put a / between after the tinyurl.com, should lead you to at least one, if not 2 pages of advice that covers these categories of things you could do to improve your signal quality at home or at a staging area. So it's 11 o'clock. We're going to skip forward to the exercise. We can always come back to the best practices slide if we have extra time at the end. So we're going to have session leaders who will be Brian and Jim. I will take a few minutes to divide you up about 50-50 in a minute. When we transition to that Zoom room, you'll need to click on a little dialogue on your screen to join that Zoom room. Your facilitator will pretend to be talking to you by radio and will use radio speak to open a net, check you in, etc., and eventually check you out. If you don't appear back here by 11:30, I will close your rooms, which is not very nice, but I expect you'll probably be done in 20 minutes. When you respond to your net controller, pretend you're on the radio. To make that more real, you could mute your mic with the Zoom control and use a trick that half of you already know, which is when your mic is muted and you want to say something briefly, you hold down your space bar. It works just like a push to talk button. That's not required, but you get extra credit if you use the space bar as your push to talk during this exercise. So I'm going to stop talking and set up the Zoom rooms. Brian or Jim, feel free to use your mics to preview, but don't open your nets until I put you in your rooms. Okay, that was a little easier than it might have been. Brian will be net control for room 1, and we'll have Eric, Laura, Lauren, and Matt check in. Use your neighborhood name as your tactical call sign. If you happen to be in the same neighborhood as somebody else, improvise. Room 2 will be Jim Wisegram as net control. He'll give us call signs, etc. Then Dan, Harriet, Jim Carlton, and Leslie will be checking in to that subnet. Any questions before I open the rooms? Have fun. See you at 11:30 or before. Please click the accept so you go to your room.